Billionaire husband threw his miscarrying wife out in the rain, calling her damaged goods. But 5 years later she returns in a Bugatti with their hidden daughter, ready to destroy everything he built. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to our channel, where stories of strength and comeback inspire us all. My heart swells with gratitude, seeing you here again. The journey of redemption and justice touches so many souls. And to my precious BDI, new family members, welcome home. You found a place where real stories remind us that no one stays broken forever. A prayer for the brokenhearted. Dear God, bring healing to those who've been cast aside and called worthless. Fill their shattered hearts with the strength to rise again. Send courage to every soul who's been humiliated, and remind them that their value was never determined by cruelty. Guide those rebuilding from betrayal toward the victory that awaits them, and let every broken woman know she was always whole. Amen. If this story moves you, please comment that you're satisfied, because knowing these journeys inspire you fills my heart with purpose. Let's continue walking through these powerful moments together, as one family. The rain fell in relentless sheets that November night, turning the streets of Manhattan into rivers of reflected neon and broken dreams. Catherine Hill stood on the marble steps of the Hanson estate, her clothes soaked through, her body trembling from more than just the cold. At 29, she'd thought she understood loss, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The ornate double doors she'd walked through as a bride 3 years ago had just slammed shut behind her, and with them, every promise Douglas Hanson had ever made. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, still aching from the miscarriage that had stolen their child just hours before. She'd needed comfort. She'd needed her husband. Instead, she'd gotten 3 words that would haunt her for the next 5 years. Damaged goods now. The memory of his voice, cold, clinical, devoid of the warmth she'd once believed was real, cut deeper than any physical pain. Douglas had stood in their palatial living room, his 6'3" frame rigid with disgust, and looked at her as though she were something broken, beyond repair. The man who'd once promised to love her through anything couldn't even look at her after she'd lost their baby. Catherine had no family to call, no safety net, just a small savings account and the clothes on her back as she walked away from the only home she'd known since marrying into the Hanson dynasty. But that was 5 years ago. The purr of the Bugatti Chiron's engine announced her return before anyone saw her face, obsidian black with chrome accents. The $3.9 million machine glided through Manhattan's financial district like a panther stalking prey. Behind the wheel sat a woman transformed, no longer the soft-spoken Catherine who'd once apologized for taking up space. This Catherine wore confidence like armor, her designer sunglasses reflecting the skyline she'd once been exiled from. In the passenger seat, a 4-year-old girl with dark curls and piercing green eyes. Douglas's eyes gazed out at the towering buildings with quiet curiosity. Little Natalie knew her mother's story and the way children understand grown-up pain. Incompletely, but with fierce loyalty. Catherine had kept her hidden for good reason. Douglas didn't deserve to know about the miracle that came 10 months after he'd thrown her away, the daughter conceived in their final days together before everything shattered. Catherine Hill had spent 5 years doing the impossible. She'd clawed her way from rock bottom to the executive suite of Sterling Global Investments, becoming one of the youngest portfolio managers in the firm's history. Every deal she closed, every million she earned, every power suit she wore, was another brick in the fortress she'd built around her broken heart. Her transformation wasn't just professional, it was strategic. She'd studied Douglas's business empire, identified its vulnerabilities, and positioned herself to strike when the moment was right. That moment had arrived. The Bugatti pulled to a stop outside Hanson Tower, the gleaming testament to Douglas's inherited wealth and ruthless ambition. Catherine removed her sunglasses slowly, her gaze traveling up the 50-story monument to the man who'd destroyed her. She'd been inside this building once before as the dutiful wife attending a charity gala, smiling for cameras, while Douglas networked with Manhattan's elite. Back then, she'd been an accessory. Today, she was a threat. "Mommy, is this where Daddy works?" Natalie's voice was small but steady, her child's intuition sensing the gravity of this moment. Catherine turned to her daughter, smoothing a curl from her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the steel in her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. And today, everything changes." The valet's eyes widened as Catherine stepped out of the Bugatti, her burgundy power suit tailored to perfection. her heels clicking against the pavement with authority. She'd chosen this outfit carefully, the color of wine and blood, of power and revenge. As she lifted Natalie from the passenger seat, whispers rippled through the crowd of executives and assistants entering the building for the morning rush. Inside the lobby, Catherine's reflection stared back at her from the polished marble walls. She barely recognized herself. Gone was the woman who'd begged for compassion in the rain. In her place stood someone Douglas Hanson had never anticipated, his equal, or perhaps his superior. The private elevator to the executive floor required a keycard, one Catherine had acquired, through means Douglas would discover soon enough. As the doors slid closed, sealing her and Natalie inside, Catherine felt the familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with something darker. Justice, reckoning, the settling of debts long overdue. 50 floors rose beneath them, each one bringing her closer to the confrontation she'd meticulously planned. Douglas had no idea she was coming. He had no idea about Natalie. He had no idea that the broken woman he'd discarded had become the architect of his unraveling. The elevator chimed softly as it reached the executive floor. The doors opened to reveal the nerve center of Hanson Enterprises, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, assistants moving efficiently between offices, and somewhere in the corner suite, Douglas Hanson himself, still believing he was untouchable. Catherine stepped forward, Natalie's small hand clasped firmly in hers, and smiled. He was about to learn just how wrong he'd been. 5 years earlier, the rain had finally stopped by the time Catherine found herself standing outside a 24-hour diner in Queens, shivering in her soaked clothes with exactly $47 in her wallet. She'd taken 3 trains to get far enough from Manhattan that she wouldn't accidentally run into anyone from Douglas's world. The fluorescent lights inside the diner felt harsh and unforgiving, but at least it was warm. "You look like you need coffee, honey." The waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and tired feet, placed a steaming cup in front of Catherine, without being asked. "And maybe some pie." Catherine opened her mouth to say she couldn't afford both, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, tears came, not the dignified kind she'd learned to cry at Hanson family functions, but raw, ugly sobs that shook her entire body. The waitress said nothing, just slid into the booth across from her, and waited. That night became the first of many small kindnesses that kept Catherine alive when giving up felt easier. The waitress, Rita, offered her a couch to sleep on. Within a week, Catherine had found work washing dishes at the diner. Within 2 weeks, she'd added a second job cleaning offices at night. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford, but survival required sacrifice. The first 3 months were the hardest. Catherine's hands, once smooth from expensive hand creams and weekly manicures, became raw and cracked from detergent and hard work. Her back ached constantly. She lost 15 pounds she didn't have to lose, but something else was happening beneath the exhaustion and pain. She was discovering a strength she'd never needed before. During her commutes between jobs, Catherine started reading business books borrowed from the library, success stories of people who'd climbed from nothing, finance articles she barely understood at first but slowly began to grasp. If Douglas had taught her anything during their marriage, it was that money meant power. She'd been powerless once, never again. 6 months after that brutal November night, Catherine enrolled in night classes at a community college, using every spare dollar she'd saved. Business administration, accounting, marketing. She studied on subway platforms and during her 15-minute breaks, absorbing information like her life depended on it. Because it did, Rita watched her transformation with quiet pride. "You're going to be something special," she'd say, refilling Catherine's coffee during the late-night shifts. "I can see it in you." But Catherine's body had other plans. 2 months into her courses, she started feeling nauseous during morning shifts. At first, she blamed exhaustion and the greasy diner food. Then she missed her period. Then another. The pregnancy test she bought from the drugstore came back positive, and Catherine's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. She was pregnant. With Douglas's child. The man who'd called her damaged goods and thrown her into the rain was going to be the father of her baby. For 3 days, she didn't tell anyone. She went through the motions of work and classes, her mind spinning with impossible questions. How could she raise a child while working 3 jobs and attending school? How could she afford prenatal care? How could she do any of this alone? But on the 4th day, something shifted. Catherine placed her hand on her still flat stomach and made a decision that would define the next 5 years of her life. This child wasn't Douglas's. This child was hers, and she would give her baby everything she'd lost: stability, love, and a mother who would never give up. The pregnancy became fuel rather than obstacle. Catherine worked harder, studied longer, pushed herself beyond what seemed possible. She found a better apartment, took on freelance bookkeeping work, and networked relentlessly. When Natalie was born, Catherine took exactly 2 weeks off before returning to her classes, the baby strapped to her chest as she studied. 3 years after being thrown out, Catherine landed her first real interview at Sterling Global Investments. She walked into that glass tower wearing a thrift store suit she'd altered herself, carrying a portfolio of freelance work and academic achievements that proved what she'd become. The interview panel consisted of 4 executives, all men, all skeptical. Catherine met their doubt with confidence born from survival. "Why should we hire someone with no traditional experience?" the senior partner asked, his tone dismissive. Catherine leaned forward, her voice steady. "Because I understand what it means to build something from nothing. I know how to turn liabilities into assets, and I work harder than anyone you'll ever meet because failure isn't an option for me. It never will be again." She got the job. That moment in Sterling's boardroom, hearing, "Welcome to the team," felt like the first full breath she'd taken in 3 years. Catherine Hill wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rising, and with each promotion, each successful deal, each zero added to her bank account, she was building something Douglas Hanson would never see coming. A reckoning. Natalie turned 5 on a Tuesday in April, and Catherine threw her a party in their penthouse overlooking Central Park. There were balloons, a custom cake from the bakery Natalie loved, and a handful of carefully selected friends from her private preschool. No family. Catherine had made sure of that. As she watched her daughter blow out the candles, her dark curls bouncing with excitement, Catherine saw Douglas in every feature. The sharp green eyes that missed nothing, the determined set of her jaw when she wanted something, the way she commanded a room even at 5 years old, natural and unafraid. Natalie was her father's daughter in appearance, but in heart, she belonged entirely to Catherine. That night, after the guests had left and the apartment had grown quiet, Natalie climbed into Catherine's lap with a question she'd been asking more frequently. "Mommy, why don't I have a daddy like the other kids?" Catherine had been preparing for this conversation for months, rehearsing different versions in her mind. But now, with her daughter's innocent eyes searching her face, all the practiced words felt inadequate. She took a breath and chose honesty. Filtered through a 5-year-old's understanding, "You do have a daddy, sweetheart. His name is Douglas." Catherine smoothed Natalie's curls, gathering courage. "But he doesn't know about you yet." "Why not?" "Because when you were still growing in my tummy, your daddy and I had to stop being together. He made some choices that hurt me very badly, and I had to leave. By the time I knew you were coming, we were already apart." Natalie processed this with the seriousness of a child far older than her years. Did he not want me? The question pierced Catherine's heart. "He doesn't know about you, baby. That's different. I chose to keep you safe and close to me, while I figured out how to be strong enough for both of us. Are you strong enough now?" Catherine smiled, tears threatening at the edges of her eyes. "Yes. I think I finally am. Can I meet him?" "Very soon," Catherine promised. "In fact, that's part of why we've been practicing our brave faces. Remember? When you meet your daddy, things might feel confusing. He might say things that don't make sense yet. But I need you to remember something important. You are not a mistake. You are not unwanted. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and you made me strong when I thought I was broken." Natalie wrapped her small arms around Catherine's neck. "You're not broken, Mommy. You're the strongest person I know." Later, after Natalie had fallen asleep, Catherine stood by her daughter's bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. She thought back to a time when Douglas had been her entire world. 5 years earlier, Catherine had been a different woman. She'd met Douglas at a charity gala, dazzled by his confidence and wealth. He'd pursued her relentlessly, made her feel special, chosen. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and promises of a future filled with everything money could buy. She'd molded herself to fit his world, changed her clothes, her friends, her dreams. Douglas liked his wife polished and presentable, so Catherine became exactly that. She'd given up her job at a small marketing firm because Douglas insisted his wife didn't need to work. She'd stopped calling old friends because they didn't fit the Hanson social circle. Slowly, without even noticing, Catherine had erased herself to become Mrs. Douglas Hanson. The miscarriage had shattered the illusion. When she'd needed him most, when vulnerability had stripped away all pretense, Douglas had shown his true nature. She wasn't his partner or equal. She was an investment that had failed to deliver. But 10 months later, when she discovered she was pregnant again, a miracle, given the trauma her body had endured, Catherine had made a choice that saved her life. This child would never know the man who'd called her mother damaged goods, not until Catherine was ready, not until she had the power to protect them both. Catherine's phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her from the memory. Tomorrow was the day. Tomorrow, Douglas would learn that the wife he'd discarded had returned, and he would meet the daughter he'd never known existed. Catherine kissed Natalie's forehead gently, careful not to wake her. Tomorrow, baby girl, you're going to meet your father, and he's going to learn what it costs to throw away something precious. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline where Douglas's tower stood among the others, lit up against the night sky. For 5 years, she'd worked toward this moment. Every late night, every sacrifice, every dollar earned, had been building to tomorrow. Natalie stirred in her sleep, murmuring something Catherine couldn't quite hear. She returned to the bed, stroking her daughter's hair until the child settled back into peaceful dreams. "He's going to try to love you when he sees you," Catherine whispered. "They always do when they realize what they've lost. But this time, I'm in control. This time, I decide what happens next." The morning sun caught the Bugatti's obsidian paint as Catherine pulled out of her building's private garage, the $3.8 million machine purring like a predator awakening. She'd chosen the Chiron deliberately. Douglas had always talked about owning one, back when they were married, but even his wealth had limits. Now Catherine owned what he'd only dreamed about, and she was about to drive it straight into his past. "Mommy, everyone is staring," Natalie observed from the passenger seat, her green eyes wide as pedestrians stopped to photograph the sleek hypercar. "Let them stare, sweetheart. We've earned this." Catherine navigated through Manhattan's morning traffic with practiced ease, the Chiron's 1,500 horsepower engine barely restrained beneath her touch. The city looked different from behind this wheel, sharper, clearer, like she was finally seeing it through the lens of power rather than survival. They passed the diner in Queens where Rita had once given her free coffee and a place to sleep. Catherine made a mental note to stop by later. After everything was done, Rita deserved to see how her investment in a broken woman had paid off. But first, there was unfinished business. The route took them past landmarks of Catherine's old life. The boutique where Douglas had once bought her clothes, choosing styles he preferred over what she liked. The salon where she'd gotten her hair done every week because he insisted his wife maintain certain standards. The park where they'd taken engagement photos, both of them smiling for a future that would crumble 5 years later in the rain. "Is that where you lived with my daddy?" Natalie pointed to the Hanson estate as it came into view, a sprawling mansion in the Upper East Side that screamed old money and older privilege. Catherine slowed the Bugatti, pulling to the curb across the street. The house looked exactly as she remembered it. Perfectly manicured gardens, stone lions guarding the entrance, windows that reflected the sky like empty eyes, giving nothing away. "Yes, baby. That's where I lived. Before you. Before I became strong." She sat there for a moment, engine idling, memories washing over her. The night Douglas had thrown her out, she'd stood on those very steps, soaked and shaking, believing her life was over. She'd been so small then, so convinced that his rejection defined her worth. Now, sitting in a car worth more than most people's houses, her daughter beside her and a plan sharpened by 5 years of preparation, Catherine felt nothing but cold determination. "Are we going in?" Natalie asked. "Not yet. First, your father needs to be reminded of what he lost, and I know exactly where to find him." Catherine pulled away from the curb, the Chiron accelerating smoothly. She checked her watch. 11:47 a.m. Douglas always took lunch at Le Bernardin on Thursdays, the same high-end restaurant where they'd had their first date. Some habits, apparently, never died. The restaurant's valet nearly dropped his clipboard when Catherine pulled up. She stepped out of the Bugatti with the grace of someone who'd spent 5 years learning to command every room she entered. Her tailored burgundy suit cost more than Douglas used to spend on her entire wardrobe. Her heels were Louboutin. Her watch was Patek Philippe. Everything about her screamed success, wealth, and power, earned rather than inherited. She lifted Natalie from the passenger seat, smoothing her daughter's dress. "Remember what we talked about. Brave face, Natalie repeated, standing a little straighter. Inside, Le Bernardin hadn't changed. Same elegant decor. Same hushed conversations of Manhattan's elite. Same sommelier who'd served Catherine and Douglas 7 years ago, though he didn't recognize her now. Why would he? That Catherine had been a different person entirely. The maître d' approached with a professional smile. "Good afternoon. Do you have a reservation?" "I'm meeting someone," Catherine said smoothly, her eyes scanning the dining room. And there he was. Douglas Hanson sat at a corner table, exactly where he'd sat on their first date, deep in conversation with 2 men in expensive suits. He looked older than she remembered, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 5 years ago, gray threading through his dark hair. But he still carried himself with that same arrogance, that unshakable belief that the world existed to serve him. Catherine felt Natalie's hand tighten in hers. "That's him? That's him." She started walking toward his table, each step deliberate. The conversations around her seemed to fade. The entire restaurant narrowed to just this moment, this confrontation she'd orchestrated for 5 years. Douglas looked up as she approached, and Catherine watched his expression shift through a dozen emotions in seconds. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, shock. The wine glass in his hand froze halfway to his lips. "Hello, Douglas," Catherine said, her voice steady and cold. "It's been a while." His face had gone pale. "Catherine? Surprised? You shouldn't be. I told you I'd rebuild myself." She gestured to Natalie, who stood beside her with those unmistakable green eyes fixed on the father she'd never met. "Douglas Hanson, meet your daughter." The wine glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the table in a spray of red that looked almost like blood. The restaurant had gone silent. Every diner, every server, every person within 20 feet had turned to watch the drama unfold. Red wine pooled across Douglas's white tablecloth, dripping onto his expensive suit. But he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on Catherine, then on Natalie, then back to Catherine, as though his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. This can't be." His voice came out strangled, barely recognizable as the commanding tone Catherine remembered. "Can't be what? Douglas? Real?" Catherine pulled out a chair at his table uninvited, settling Natalie beside her with calm precision. "But it is. Very real. Just like the rain was real 5 years ago when you threw me out. Just like the miscarriage was real. Just like the words, damaged goods were real." Douglas's business associates exchanged uncomfortable glances and quietly excused themselves, gathering their belongings and fleeing the awkwardness. Smart men. They recognized a reckoning when they saw one. "Catherine, Douglas ran his hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd never seen him make before. The unflappable billionaire was flapping. "You disappeared. You left no forwarding address, no contact information. I tried to." "You tried to what?" Catherine's voice was silk over steel. "Find me? Track me down? Make amends?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. "Don't insult my intelligence with lies, Douglas. You didn't look for me. You discarded me like broken furniture and moved on with your life. Tell me, how long did it take before you replaced me? A month? A week?" His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "Fair?" The word came out sharp enough to cut. "You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you about fair, Douglas. Fair would have been compassion when I lost our baby. Fair would have been holding me instead of judging me. Fair would have been remembering the vows you made about sickness and health. Better or worse." Natalie sat quietly, her green eyes, his eyes moving between her parents like she was watching a tennis match. Catherine placed a protective hand on her daughter's shoulder. "But since you mentioned looking for me," Catherine continued, her voice dropping to something more dangerous, "let me fill you in on what you missed. I spent the first 3 months sleeping on a couch in Queens, working as a dishwasher. My hands bled from the chemicals. I ate 1 meal a day because that's all I could afford. I cried myself to sleep every night in that tiny apartment, wondering what I'd done to deserve being thrown away. Douglas's face had gone pale. Catherine, I didn't know. No, you didn't. Because you didn't care to know. But here's what you really didn't know, Douglas. 10 months after you threw me out, I discovered I was pregnant again. A miracle, the doctors called it. Given what my body had been through, his eyes widened, darting to Natalie and back. You were. But how? How? Really? Do I need to explain basic biology to you? Catherine's laugh was cold. She was conceived in those final weeks before the miscarriage, before everything fell apart. But I didn't know, until later, and when I found out, I had a choice to make. You should have told me. His voice cracked. I had a right to know. You had a right? Catherine's composure finally showed its first crack, anger flashing in her eyes. You forfeited every right when you called me damaged goods and slammed the door in my face. You forfeited your rights when you chose cruelty over compassion. You forfeited your rights when you proved that to you. I was nothing more than a functional uterus that failed to perform. Douglas reached toward Natalie, his hand trembling. She's mine? She's really mine? Catherine intercepted his hand, her grip firm. Don't. You don't get to touch her. Not yet. Not until you understand what it cost me to keep her safe from you. Safe from me? I would never hurt. You already did. Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried more weight than any shout. You hurt her mother in ways that still leave scars. You think I was going to hand my daughter over to a man who taught me that love has conditions, that worth is measured by performance, that human beings can be thrown away when they don't meet expectations. The fight seemed to drain out of Douglas. He slumped back in his chair, looking older than his 37 years. What do you want from me, Catherine? I want you to look at her, Catherine said softly. Really look at her. This is Natalie Rose. She's 5 years old. She's brilliant and kind and brave. She loves books and chocolate ice cream and asking questions about everything. She's never known her father because her father didn't know how to be a man when it mattered most. Natalie, who'd been silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. Hi. Her small voice carried across the table. Douglas's eyes filled with tears. Hi, he managed. Mommy says you made mistakes. Natalie continued with the brutal honesty of childhood. She says people deserve second chances if they learn from their mistakes. Did you learn, Mindy? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Catherine watched Douglas struggle to answer, watching him see himself reflected in his daughter's innocent eyes. I'm learning, he whispered. Right now, I'm learning. Catherine stood, straightening her suit. Good. Because tomorrow, Douglas, we're going to discuss the terms of your learning curve. And trust me, you're going to want to pay very close attention. She guided Natalie toward the exit, the entire restaurant still watching. As they reached the door, Catherine turned back one last time. Oh, and Douglas? That wine stain on your suit? Consider it a metaphor. Some stains don't wash out. Some mistakes leave permanent marks. Remember that. The Bugatti was waiting outside, gleaming in the afternoon sun like a victory banner. The next morning, Catherine arrived at Douglas's private office in Hanson Tower without an appointment. His assistant tried to stop her, but one look at Catherine's face made the woman step aside. Some battles weren't worth fighting, and this clearly wasn't hers. Douglas was on the phone when Catherine walked in, closing the door behind her with a decisive click. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features before hardening into something defensive. I'll call you back, he said into the phone, ending the call without waiting for a response. Catherine, you can't just barge in here. Sit down, Douglas. Her voice was calm, but it carried an edge that made him comply instinctively. She placed a manila folder on his desk, thick with documents. We need to talk about why I really kept Natalie away from you, and it wasn't just about the rain and your cruelty. Though that was reason enough. He eyed the folder warily. What is that? Your past? Or should I say, your secrets? Catherine settled into the chair across from him, crossing her legs with deliberate composure. You see, during our marriage, I was the dutiful wife. Quiet. Obedient. Invisible. But invisible people see things, Douglas. They hear conversations they're not supposed to hear. They find documents left carelessly on home office desks. His jaw tightened. I don't know what you think you found. The Meridian deal. Catherine watched the color drain from his face. The one that made you a fortune 5 years ago. The one that established Hanson Enterprises as a major player in commercial real estate. Want to know what I discovered about how you closed that deal? Douglas's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. You're fishing, am I? Catherine opened the folder, pulling out the first document. This is a copy of the wire transfer you made to City Councilman Porter 3 days before the zoning committee voted to approve your development project. $2.3 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Strange timing, don't you think? That was a consulting fee. For what? His expertise in taking bribes? Catherine laid out another document. Here's the email chain between you and Marcus Ewan, discussing how to incentivize the planning commissioner. Your words, not mine. And here, she produced a third paper, is the falsified environmental impact report you submitted to get the permits approved faster. The real report, the one your engineers actually produced, showed significant groundwater contamination. You buried it. Douglas stood abruptly, his chair rolling back and hitting the window. Where did you get these? I told you, I was invisible. The night of the gala, remember? When you were in your study with Marcus and that consultant, discussing how to handle the Porter situation, I was right outside the door. You never even checked. Why would you? I was just decorative furniture to you. This is blackmail. His voice shook with barely controlled rage. No, Douglas. This is justice. Catherine's calm never wavered. I've had these documents for 5 years. I could have destroyed you at any time, but I didn't. And do you know why? He said nothing, his face a mask of fury and fear. Because of Natalie. I kept your secrets to protect our daughter from having a father in prison. I kept them because, despite everything you did to me, I didn't want her to grow up knowing her father was a criminal. I gave you mercy you never earned and certainly never gave me. What do you want? The question came out defeated. Catherine stood, collecting the documents and returning them to the folder. I want you to understand what's at stake. I want you to know that the woman you called damaged goods now holds your entire empire in her hands. Every deal, every bribe, every corner you cut, it's all documented, all verified, all ready to be delivered to the district attorney's office. You wouldn't. But his voice lacked conviction. I would. I will. Catherine moved toward the door, then paused. Unless you give me what I want, which is everything. The word hung in the air like a blade. Your compliance, your cooperation, your complete and total acknowledgement that you are only standing in this office because I allow it. Tomorrow morning, you're going to transfer 40% of Hanson Enterprises into a trust fund for Natalie. You're going to give me full custody with visitation rights determined by me, and you're going to publicly apologize for your treatment of me 5 years ago. Douglas's laugh was bitter. And if I refuse, then by tomorrow afternoon, every media outlet in New York will have copies of these documents. The DA will have them, the SEC will have them, and Hanson Enterprises will be destroyed before the market closes. You'll spend the next decade fighting criminal charges, and Natalie will know exactly what kind of man her father really is. She opened the door, natural light flooding into the suddenly suffocating office. You have until noon tomorrow to decide. Choose wisely, Douglas. For once in your life, choose wisely. The door closed behind her with quiet finality, leaving Douglas alone with the weight of his past sins and the future he could no longer control. Douglas chose poorly. At 11:47 a.m. the following morning, 13 minutes before Catherine's deadline, he called a press conference attempting to get ahead of the story. His PR team had crafted a statement about alleged improprieties and unfounded accusations from a disgruntled former spouse. He stood behind the podium in Hanson Tower's conference room, cameras flashing, reporters assembled, and tried to spin the narrative his way. Catherine watched from her office at Sterling Global, a slight smile playing at her lips as she live-streamed the conference on her laptop. He looked confident, practiced, like a man who believed money and power could still save him. Then her phone buzzed. A single text to her attorney, release everything, by 12:03 p.m. Every major news outlet in New York had received the complete file. Wire transfers, email chains, falsified reports, bank statements, 5 years of meticulously documented corruption, all verified, all damning, all undeniable. Douglas was still answering softball questions from friendly reporters when the first journalist's phone pinged with an alert, then another, then a dozen. Catherine watched as confusion rippled through the press room. Reporters frantically checking their devices. One brave soul from the Times raised her hand. "Mr. Hansen, we've just received documents showing wire transfers totaling $2.3 million to City Councilman Porter days before the Meridian zoning vote. Would you care to comment?" Douglas's face went white. That's taken out of context. What about the falsified environmental impact reports?" Another reporter, smelling blood in the water. Or the email discussing how to incentivize planning commissioners. The press conference deteriorated into chaos. Douglas tried to maintain composure, but Catherine could see the panic creeping into his eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed empire was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to thousands of viewers. He left the podium without another word, his PR team scrambling to contain a fire that was already out of control. By 2 p.m., Hansen Enterprises stock had dropped 42%. Trading was temporarily halted. By 4 p.m., 3 major investors had pulled out of pending deals worth a combined $340 million. Douglas's phone rang constantly with board members, attorneys, and business partners demanding explanations he couldn't provide. Catherine received updates throughout the afternoon from her network of contacts. The district attorney's office had opened a formal investigation. The SEC was reviewing the documents. Federal prosecutors were getting involved. The dominoes were falling exactly as she'd planned. That evening, she drove to Hansen Tower one final time. The building was nearly empty, most employees having fled the sinking ship. Security let her pass without question. Everyone knew who she was now, the woman who'd brought down Douglas Hansen. She found him in his office, sitting in the dark, staring out at the Manhattan skyline he'd once believed he owned. Empty liquor bottles littered his desk. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 8 hours. "Catherine," his voice was hollow. "Come to watch the show?" She stood in the doorway, backlit by the hallway lights. "No. I came to see if you understood yet." "Understood what?" "That you destroyed me? Mission accomplished." He gestured bitterly at the city below. "Everything I built, gone. You must be thrilled. You still don't get it." Catherine stepped into the office, her heels clicking against marble. "I didn't destroy you, Douglas. You destroyed yourself years ago when you chose cruelty over compassion, when you decided human beings were disposable, when you built your empire on lies and corruption. I just held up a mirror. This isn't about justice. This is revenge." He finally looked at her, and she saw no remorse in his eyes. Just anger. Just loss of control. "You're punishing me because I hurt your feelings 5 years ago." Catherine laughed, sharp and cold. "You think this is about hurt feelings? You threw me out in the rain after I lost our baby. You called me damaged goods. You let me believe I was worthless, but even after all that, I gave you mercy. I kept your secrets for 5 years to protect our daughter from knowing what her father really was. Then why?" His voice cracked. "Why do this now? Because you had to understand what it feels like to lose everything in a single moment, to watch your entire world collapse and know you're powerless to stop it." She moved closer, her voice dropping to something more dangerous. "You took everything from me once. I rebuilt from nothing. But you? You've never known real loss. You've never had to fight for survival. You've never been truly powerless." Douglas slumped forward, elbows on his desk, head in his hands. But Catherine saw the truth. He wasn't broken by remorse. He was broken by loss of control. The tears he fought weren't for the lives he'd damaged or the laws he'd broken. They were for himself. "The DA will offer you a deal," Catherine said, turning toward the door. "Cooperate fully. Testify against your co-conspirators, and maybe you'll only serve 5 years instead of 20. Use that time to become the man Natalie deserves to call father. Or don't. The choice is yours." She paused at the threshold. "Oh, and Douglas? The 40% of the company I demanded?" I'm donating it to a foundation for women rebuilding their lives after domestic abuse and abandonment. Every dollar you made through corruption will now help heal the damage men like you cause." Catherine walked out, leaving Douglas alone in his crumbling tower, exactly as he'd left her 5 years ago. But unlike him, she hadn't just destroyed, she'd rebuilt something better. 3 weeks after Douglas's empire began its collapse, Catherine stood in her penthouse apartment, packing the last of their belongings. The news cycle had moved on to fresh scandals. But the damage to Hansen Enterprises was permanent. Douglas had accepted the DA's plea deal that morning. 5 years minimum, possibly 8 with good behavior. His attorneys had called her, asking if she felt any satisfaction. She'd hung up without answering. The truth was more complicated than satisfaction. Catherine had spent 5 years building toward this moment, and now that it had arrived, she felt something unexpected. Freedom, not the hollow victory of revenge, but genuine liberation from the weight she'd carried since that rain-soaked November night. "Mommy, are we really leaving?" Natalie appeared in the doorway, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. At 5 years old, she understood they were going somewhere new. But not all the reasons why. Catherine knelt down, smoothing her daughter's dark curls. "We are, sweetheart. Remember how we talked about fresh starts, where people don't know our story yet?" Natalie recited carefully. "Exactly. Your daddy needs time to learn how to be better. And we need time to be happy. Without looking back, will he visit when he's done learning?" Catherine considered the question. Douglas had written her a letter from his attorney's office, not apologizing exactly, but acknowledging what he'd taken from her. It wasn't enough. It might never be enough. But Natalie deserved the chance to know her father, if he could become worthy of knowing. "Maybe," Catherine said honestly, "if he proves he understands what he did wrong. But that's his job to figure out, not ours." The foundation Catherine had established was already operational. 40% of Hansen Enterprises' value converted into resources for women rebuilding their lives. Housing assistance, job training, legal support, childcare. Every service Catherine had desperately needed 5 years ago was now available to others walking the same brutal path. Rita from the diner had been her first call when the foundation launched. "I want you on the board," Catherine had said. "You saved my life once. Help me save others." The older woman had cried, then accepted. By noon, Catherine and Natalie were in the Bugatti, the penthouse behind them, and the open road ahead. Catherine had accepted a position at a venture capital firm in San Francisco, one that specialized in funding women-owned businesses. New city, new chapter, new life built on her own terms. As they drove through Manhattan one final time, Natalie pressed her face to the window, watching the familiar buildings slide past. "Will you miss it here?" "Parts of it," Catherine admitted, "but I'm ready for what comes next." "Are you?" "Yes." Natalie's voice was small but certain. "We're brave. Remember? The bravest." They crossed the George Washington Bridge as afternoon melted into evening. Catherine had mapped a scenic route, wanting to take their time, to let the transition feel intentional rather than rushed. The highway stretched before them, ribbons of asphalt leading west toward everything unknown and possible. Somewhere near the Pennsylvania border, Natalie fell asleep, her stuffed rabbit clutched tight. Catherine glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror, her heart swelling with fierce protective love. This child, conceived in the final days of a broken marriage, had become Catherine's reason for everything. Her motivation, her purpose, her proof that beauty could emerge from devastation. The sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose gold, the same colors that had filled the Manhattan skyline the night Catherine had been thrown out into the rain. But this sunset felt different. Not an ending, but a beginning. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from her new boss. "Can't wait to have you on the team. You're going to change lives here." She smiled, then turned her attention back to the road. Miles passed. States changed. The rearview mirror held nothing but distance and fading light, the past growing smaller with every mile. Catherine thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, broken and shivering on marble steps, believing the cruel words of a man who'd never deserved her trust. That woman was gone. In her place was someone stronger, forged in the fires of survival and tempered by the determination to never be powerless again. Catherine had lost everything once and discovered she was capable of rebuilding from ruins. She'd been called damaged goods and proved that no one's cruelty could define her worth. As the sky deepened to purple and the first stars emerged, Catherine spoke softly, not wanting to wake Natalie but needing to say the words aloud. I was never damaged goods. I'm stronger than I ever thought I was. She glanced at her sleeping daughter, love and pride flooding through her. And so is she. The Bugatti's engine purred beneath her, a reminder of how far she'd come. The road stretched endlessly forward, full of possibility and promise. Behind them, Douglas Hanson sat in a cell, finally facing consequences he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. But Catherine wasn't thinking about him anymore. She was thinking about tomorrow, about the foundation that would help thousands of women find their strength, about the daughter who would grow up knowing her mother never gave up, about the future she'd earned through blood, tears, and unbreakable will. The highway lights flickered past like stars falling to earth, and Catherine Hill drove forward into her new beginning, leaving the damaged woman she'd never really been somewhere in the darkness behind her. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought, and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.